Hey guys, Tony here. And we have reached the finale. So this will be the last of the Rook Pawn series. So this is Practical Endings number 3. And I actually wasn't intending to make this video, but then I thought for completeness sake that I probably should. So this video will cover the opposite scenario of what we saw before. So in parts 1 and parts 2, we saw that the attacker, that being the person who was up the pawn, in this case it was always a rook pawn, had the passive rook, and so his rook was normally trapped on one of these squares, and black's rook was very active behind the pawn. So that was parts 1 and 2. In this part, we're going to talk about when the attacker manages to get the rook to the active square and the defender's rook is stuck on one of the passive squares. And usually that's enough to win. So this ending is quite a bit more simple. This video will hopefully be quite a bit shorter than the other videos. And hopefully this is a nice sort of softball for everyone to finish out the series and feel like they really got it. So I have 3 examples, and the first one is the easiest one. This is a game that I played on Lichess, actually. This is a 3+2 game, so nothing serious, just some silly internet blitz, probably while I was at work. And we reached this position. This is black's 39th move, black to move. And in fact, I just played rook b3 to b5. So it was clear to me that if I'm down a piece, of course, but I have these 2 massive pawns on the queen side, and it occurred to me that with my rook on b3, if I did nothing, black would likely play bishop c5 to a7 and blockade these pawns. And while I might not be worse because these pawns lock down as pieces, I felt like I shouldn't allow that. Now, what I at least failed to consider, it's not bad for me or anything, but I failed to consider that black could play bishop c5 here anyway. The point being, of course, that if I do nothing, for instance a6, black will go bishop a7, and we reach the scenario I talked about before, where I can't really make progress with these pawns. Now, his other point, of course, is that rook takes c5, rook b7 at least eliminates one of these pawns, and maybe black has a chance of holding on to the game. And this is how the game continued, and I took on e5, gobbling up another pawn and threatening to win another one with rook takes e6, so black naturally played king f7. And this is our first critical position, so take a second and decide what you play here as white. Okay, there are actually a wide variety of winning moves here for white, but the ones that I wanted you to find, hopefully, are the ones that put this rook behind this pawn. So the strongest is likely a6, and after rook a7, rook a5. But other moves win as well. In the game, I played rook e4, and after rook a7, of course, I continued with rook a4, and black played rook a6. The only reason why I would say maybe a6 is stronger is because usually in these endings, it's to your benefit to have this pawn pushed as far as it can go. Because in this case, our rook is the active one and has all of these squares to work with, whereas black's rook only really has these 2 squares. You can see that if black's rook ever leaves, a7 is just instantly winning. So black's rook is unbelievably inactive and is essentially permanently tethered to blockading this pawn. And rooks are not particularly good blockaders. So it's usually to the attacker's benefit to push this pawn as far as it can go. So a6 was slightly more precise, but I played rook e4, knowing that just putting the rook behind the pawn was essentially good enough to win. So this is how the game continued, and this is a good time to stop to talk about the high-level sort of plan for the attacker here. So in this case, white's the attacker, and the winning plan is as follows. It's relatively simple. White will, in this case, white will centralize the king and threaten to walk over to the queen side. And as you'll see in the game, if black does nothing about this, the king lands on b5, the rook will essentially go to a8, this pawn goes to a7, and the king comes to b7 or whatever. Essentially, the king and the rook usher this rook pawn to the promised land, and the game ends very succinctly. So usually what happens is white will centralize the king and black will counter, such that the king doesn't make it into b5. So you can imagine my king gets to d4, black's king gets to d6, king c4, king c6, stopping it. The problem, as we'll see, is that white can essentially zugzwang the king into moving, and then white will either get into the king side, the queen side rather, and make progress with the pawn, or white's king will head back to the king side, where usually black has been stretched too far to defend. And a lot of times, this rook can abandon the a-pawn once the king is back over here, and the king and the rook together, heading towards the king side, manage to win all three of these pawns for this pawn, or something like that. So we'll see all of those scenarios. In this game, black didn't do a very good job of meeting the plan, and so I essentially just ushered the queen's pawn to the rook pawn rather to the queening square. But in examples 2 and 3, we'll see slightly more complex variations where white has to know the winning plan of heading over to the queen side, then heading back. So this game continued king f3, king f6. So far, so good. There are other moves here. For instance, king e7 or g5. Maybe we can talk about those very briefly. It's not super important. King e4, g5, and I played f3. I just didn't want to allow g4. It doesn't much matter either way. For instance, king d4 here is just also completely winning. Essentially, with the king on f6 and my king on d4, black is not in time to block me off from playing king b5. So there's nothing really to stop him from. There's nothing really to stop me from pushing my pawn to a7. I didn't even really put anything in my notes, but yeah, king e7, king c5, for instance. Any move, king d7, king b5. The rook must move now, rook a8, and then a6. And yeah, black has a check, sure, but I think even probably king c4 is good enough. King c6, a7, rook a8, and my king's heading back now. So you can see once the Lee chess engine realizes that I can head back, it starts to think this ending is completely winning. For instance here, and you start to see a little bit of the problem that in all of these positions, let's even say these pawns, I wasn't allowed to move them. I could simply move my rook here, and black is forced to budge from this opposition, or will eventually be forced. He can play g6, he can play e5 check, he can do whatever he wants, but eventually, because his rook is passive and can no longer move, and my rook is really active, I can always lose a move with my rook. I can play rook a6, I can play rook a1, whatever, and eventually this king will have to move and let me into the e5 square. And then the game will end very quickly. So, okay, so king f3, king f6, king e4, g5, f3. Again, unnecessary. Remember king d4, g6, but then I play king d4. And it's very similar. So after king f5, king c5 rather. Let's do a little promotion. Yeah, you can already see that black is in a lot of trouble. And in fact, this rook is very well placed on a4 because it cuts off the king and also stops g4. In the game, black played g4 anyway, but it doesn't really matter. The king comes to b5, rook a8, a6, and you can see how this game isn't going to last very long. Black doesn't really have anything to compensate for the fact that just a7 and putting the king on b7 is winning. And the game concluded e5, a7, e4, hoping for rook e4, rook a7, which of course I did not play, king b6. Now the pawn is defended, so after e3, rook e4, yeah, just the game is over. e2, takes here, and so on. And even with my relatively poor endgame technique, I managed to finish this one off. So if we go back, probably around here, king f6 is just not the best defense. Probably black should go king e7, most likely, and after king f4, so now I'm threatening to head back, actually. King f6, h4, e5 check. There's actually no other really good move. anytime black moves the rook, so for instance rook a8 or rook a7, white will just simply push the pawn one square further, and black doesn't really get anywhere from passing the move. In fact, it makes his position worse. So he's really limited to making moves with these three pieces, but a king move would yield g5 or e5, and yeah, g5 loses a pawn, so really just e5 check, king e4, king e6, and again, we see the problem with black's position. White can just simply wait. So in a lot of cases when you have this opposition, you can just wait and black is forced to do something. So in this specific case, let's say king d6, of course, king f6, king d5, and my king's going to get in, so king d6 is really the only move. And now black's position essentially falls apart. Rook d1 check, king c7, and rook d5. So the e-pawn falls, and then these kingside pawns are going to fall, no doubt, now that the black king is cut off, and he still hasn't won a5 yet, in fact. So yeah, this is just complete suffering. And this is really all I wanted to say about this example. Black suffers a little bit worse in this example than usual because his pawn structure on the king side was very bad. But this is probably actually the simplest example I could find. So let me find the second example. This is Alexei Dreyev, a well-known 2700, very experienced Russian grandmaster versus Nukim Rashkovsky from the Russian Club Cup in 1998. And our position, by the way, shout out to Thibaut for he saw my videos, he saw how I had to import fens, and now you can copy and paste fens and PGNs in from here, from your analysis board, which is money. Much quicker, much more user friendly. That's how Lee Chess rolls. Okay. So again, we have a similar scenario. 3 kingside pawns each, kings on the king side, and white has this outside extra passer on the rook file with the opportunity to put the rook behind the pawn. And so I won't quiz you. Rook a2 would be a good move, but a5 is, again, slightly more accurate. You want this pawn to be generally as far as you can go. So Dreyev continued a5, rook a6, rook a2. Rook d5 would be quite a bit less accurate. Rook a2. You always want your rook behind. And now there was a little bit of shuffling around. Dreyev decided he wanted his pawns sort of in this formation, so he spent some time organizing them that way. There are maybe more succinct ways to play this, but Dreyev's way is fine. So he establishes this pawn structure on purpose. We'll see in a second why that might be the case. And again, it becomes clear that maybe white needs black's king to give, and so he wastes a move with rook a4. Of course, rook a4 is useful in that it stops the king from heading too far, but really it's just it's spending a move. In this specific position, king e5 is not very good yet. If king e5, rook e6 check, and the king just has to go back. So Dreyev waits a second. King g3, king d6. And probably actually, Dreyev didn't play this, but whoops. Probably actually already here, just f4 is good enough to win. Something like f4, king e6, king f3, f5, king e3, king d5, king d3, king c5, king c3, king b5, rook a2, rook c5, and white could just waste a move with the rook, let's say rook a1 actually, to force the king to budge. So, for instance, rook a1, and if king d5, king b4 then, and I've made a little bit of progress, or king b5, king d4, and the king is heading for the king side. But it's also possible, probably the most precise here is just rook e2. Of course, essentially all of the pawn endings where black is forced to trade rooks to win this pawn, for instance, rook a5, rook e5 check, king b6, takes, king d4. This is, of course, extremely lost for black. The king just is going to win all of the pawns, essentially. And that's one of the powers about this endgame, is that a lot of times both the king and the rook are forced to babysit this pawn, and that allows the king in. That's really the crux of it. Okay. Yeah, rook e2, I think, is just actually over. King d5, for instance, rook e5 check rather, king d6, and king b4. King c6 will be met by rook e6, but otherwise king b5 comes, and yeah, if the king moves, it moves too far away, rook e6 and takes might be possible, or king b5 is possible. And if king b5 comes and a6 is coming, it's just, yeah, black's position is falling apart. Okay, but f4 was not played in the game. Drev simply just waited another move with 58 rook a3, so let's promote that. But we'll see that all of this sort of noodling around reaches a very similar position to the line after f4. So king c5, f3, king d5, rook a4, king c5. So a lot of noodling around, but essentially because there's no actual danger of black walking over to b5 and winning the pawn, because all of those endings are losing for black, white can take his time. I mean, white has infinite time to set up the pawn structure that he pleases. And this specific pawn structure, especially when the pawn gets to f4, is nice for white, because eventually white can play f5 and coax a weakness in black's pawn structure on the king side. And that sort of will usually be the starting of the end. So if you're wondering why this pawn structure is coming, we'll probably see in a little bit why that's the case. So king e3, king d5, f4. So this position is probably could have been reached in more efficient ways, but not particularly relevant. Rook e6 check, king f3, rook a6, rook a1. Okay, and now probably king e6 would be met by king e4, and all the rook moves, let's say rook a6 would be met by a6, rook a8 would be met by a6, etc. King c5 is possible, and now we see one of white's ideas, f5, and if g takes f5, king f4, and the f5 break has all of a sudden created two fresh weaknesses in black's position, and probably after something like king d5, king takes f5, king c5, just simply rook e1 again is winning. So this is really the final step in the plan. Typical is white puts the rook behind the pawn and sort of binds black's rook to sitting passively in front. White threatens to head over to the king side. Black's king responds in kind by heading over to the queen side. White threatens to head over to the queen side, rather, sorry. Black responds similarly, heads over to the queen side, and then white switches both the king and the rook back over to the king side. And in this specific case, of course, rook a5, rook e5 check would win an easily winning king and pawn ending, but also, how does black stop rook e7 takes f7? If rook a7, then probably just king f6, and then rook e7 anyway. So, and it's very likely that the h-pawn is going to fall too, and white will win a two-pawn up ending very easily with black's king way too far away. So, so black does not play king c5 either. Black plays f6. And take a second here and think what you would play as white. Okay, there are actually two winning moves here. Kind of a trick. One is the Drev move, which is just king e3, and we'll see why that wins in a second. That's perhaps the most straightforward way to win. The second, there's a very tricky tactical breakthrough with f5. Planning f takes g5, and I believe f takes g6 in that case. And this is also, I think when I checked it, winning for white. I'll leave that up to an exercise. I don't want to get into it. It's not really necessary to know this. It's just sort of a, I don't even know what I would call it. I hesitate to call it fun fact or for something like that. But yeah, it's not, what I mean to say is it's not thematic. You don't need to win like that. So I'm not going to show it. Dreyev played king e3, and after f5, the game sort of nears the end here. The problem is that, as we see again, white will force an opposition, and black will have to either allow the king into b5 or e5, essentially. And in fact, after king d3, king c5, king c3, king b5, king d4, black resigned. But I'll continue it out a little bit further just to show you. First of all, of course, we've already seen that rook a5, and it just stands to sort of obviousness that this is completely lost for black. So black would have to play something like king c6 and then king e5. And yeah, I mean, what does black play? King b7, for instance. And then white can switch the rook back to maybe a slightly different posting. So now that white needs to essentially get into the f6 square and attack this g6 pawn, the rook is better placed on b5. So rook b5, rook b1 check rather, king c7, now rook b5. And something like king d7, king d5, king c7, rook c5 check, king d7, king c4, I believe is pretty easily winning for white. So essentially white is just going to force the king into b5 and then force the rook into some square that attacks g6. For instance, rook a7, king b4, and yeah, black sort of has to budge. The king can't come back now because the rook cuts him off. Rook a6 would be met by king b5. King e7 is met by rook c6, and this would be the game, essentially. So not a totally unjustified resignation, even though maybe at first sight it might look a little weird. Essentially, when white's king is able to get to some far advanced square like that, black is essentially lost. Okay, and the last example, this is kind of the gold standard with regards to this ending. This is Alekhine Capablanca from, I believe it's a World Championship match in Buenos Aires. And let me load this last position. Let me find the critical moment. Okay. Okay, so take a second. It should be obvious at this point what the move is. There are a couple, but there's one that's probably slightly more accurate than the rest. Take a second, find it. White to move, of course. Okay, and the move is rook d4. So again, at any of these rook endings where you have this rook pawn, take the time to put your rook behind the pawn. I mean, you could even construct an extreme example here where the pawn was on a2, and probably white's best move is rook a1, or rook d1, planning rook a1. You can always push the pawn. That's the easy part. The hard part is getting the rook behind. So, okay. So Alekhine played rook d4, rook a6, rook a4, king f6, king f3. So this is standard plan. White puts the rook behind, forces black's rook into a passive position, will centralize the king and force black's king over to likely the c6 square, and then white will work on switching both pieces back. Usually it requires some kind of finesse, wasting a tempo or 3 or 4 with this rook or whatnot, but sometimes you need to coax a weakness in black's pawn structure by pushing the h pawn or the f pawn or the g pawn, but normally white also has time to figure it out. So okay, king f3, king e5, king e3, h5. So this is about as stereotypical of and classic of a position as you can get for this ending. And it just happened to be in a world championship match. So king d3, king d5, king c3, king c5. And again, white has this opposition, wastes a move, and black goes king b5. And Alekhine actually played a sort of a funny move here. He could just go king d4, and that would be fine. And in fact, that transposes to the game, but he played king b3. And take a second and calculate the consequences of rook a5. So this is an important moment. Why is rook a5 not good? Okay, so this is kind of a trick. Rook a5, rook takes a5, rook takes a5, king c4. Hopefully everyone got here. And hopefully everyone even gets to something maybe like this. And perhaps it's not totally clear why black has lost here. It looks like he's holding on. He's only got one weakness, and he's defended it. So take a second maybe here, if you didn't find it already, and find the move for white. Okay, move is f4. And maybe now it's more clear that white is winning. Black essentially can't stop f5. And if f5 and he takes it, white will take back, and the h-pawn hangs. And then white will have this massive outside passer. And if black does not take, of course, white will just simply win both pawns by this and then this. So this is actually just something like king f8, f5 is totally lost because, yeah, white's just picking up the h-pawn for nothing, and that's a winning king and pawn ending. So after king b3, of course, black did not take and just played king back to c5, and Alekhine played king to c3, and after king b5 went king d4. So starting the last phase of the plan, the migration of the pieces back to the king side. Let's promote that. Sorry if my voice sounds a little bit grizzly. I don't know. Maybe I'm losing my voice slightly. Too many chess videos. Okay, so king d4, rook d6, king e5, rook e6 check. At least for now, keeping the king at bay, the rook on the 6th rank. And black decides to go king a6. Rook a6 would also be a move, but white would just continue on with the usual plan of getting in. And it's also possible to go f6, but I think a6, rook takes, takes, and king e4 is winning for white. Essentially, black's king is just too far away to save these kingside pawns. So king a6, and now again we see a problem. One of black's pieces is tied down to this really strong a pawn, and it's the king, and so white has quite a bit of an advantage in mobility, and uses that to put his king on a dangerous square and start attacking these pawns. So king a6, king g5, rook e5, king h6, rook f5, and maybe take a second and decide if or see if you can find the winning plan or the winning conclusion to the game, let's say. Okay. Alekhine actually played f4 here, which is a totally reasonable move. Very natural, right? Just releasing this rook from protecting this f-pawn and also restricting the movement of this rook. But there's a slightly quicker win with king g7. This is a cute line, so I'm showing it. Something like rook f3. Rook f6 is impossible. Any rook move along this direction loses f7 and g6 most likely. And any king move would just allow a6. So black goes rook f3. It's sort of the only move. King g8. Rook f6. King f8. Rook f3. King g7. So now we see white's idea. There was a small triangulation there to take away the f6 square from black's rook. And after rook f5, now f4 puts black in zugzwang. There's actually, this rook has no squares. Again, any of these moves lose f7, and something like king a7 allows a6, and black's situation only gets worse. Now black has to move the rook, of course, but then just a7, and all these pawns hang. So that was a slightly quicker win, but not particularly easy to see either. This fancy king g7 to f8 to g7 maneuver, etc., and the trapping of this rook. So instead, white played 67 f4. Still good enough to win. Rook c5. Rook a3. So it would be a serious error to allow rook c3, so white simply prevents black's counterplay and forces him to find more moves. Rook c7, king g7. So white's plan is coming to fruition here. Eventually this rook is going to switch back and get in. Rook d7. And again, there's more than one way to win here. For instance, Alekhine played f5, which is very thematic. Again, fracturing this pawn structure. But it's also possible to just play king f6 here. And after something like rook c7, f5, similar, king takes f5, rook c5 check, king f6, rook c7, rook f3. White is just winning. So if king a5, rook f5 check takes h5, and then rook h7 is going to bag this other pawn, and white will win in rook ending 2 pawns up. So that's easy enough. Instead, Alekhine played, instead of king f6, Alekhine played f5 immediately, which is also fine. And after takes, king h6 was his idea, picking up the h-pawn. And the game concluded, I mean, black's position is essentially falling apart already. The game concluded f4, g takes, rook d5. So this is black's idea with f5, by the way. Hanging onto the h-pawn, trying to keep this pawn structure symmetrical. If instead black were to allow king takes h5 and king g5, the game would end quite quickly. So this is really the only way to defend for the time being, but king g7, rook f5, rook a4, holding down the fort, king b5, and rook e4. Of course, again, king takes a5, rook e5 check. So black, again, just has to waste moves. King h6. And again, king takes a5, rook e5. This time, if rook takes a5, rook e5. And this is what happened in the game. But yeah, rook takes h5. The rook is going to come back over and win the f-pawn. For instance, I think the game concluded rook a1, king takes, rook g1, rook g5, rook h1, rook f5. King b6, rook takes f7, king c6, and rook e7. And with black's king cut off and 2 extra pawns, the ending is trivially winning for white. Okay, wow. Sorry if I went through these a little bit quickly. Yeah, the only thing you really need to know about this ending, I think, that's most important is the general plan that if in these endings you have the chance, first of all, to get your rook behind the pawn, that's a massive advantage. When you have the active rook and your opponent has the passive rook, it severely restricts the mobility of this rook, and the plan of just switching the king from threatening king b5, essentially, in a position like this, the threat of king b5 compels black to put his king over here, and then you switch back. And then usually switch back with the rook as well, but sometimes that's not strictly necessary. And that should be the key takeaway from this video. Sometimes the specifics with losing a rook move and finding a way to create a weakness can be a little bit complicated, but in general, these endings tend to be easily winning for the attacker and are certainly easier than the endings we talked about in videos 1 and 2. So I hope you guys enjoy it. Let me know if you'd like to see more in the practical ending series. I have some ideas, but if people are really itching for me to cover any ending specifically, I might do that. Again, usually the stuff that'll be in these endings videos will be endings that I'm working on myself. But if people are really clamoring for some specific ending, then I'd be happy to dedicate some time to it. Hope you guys liked it. I will see you back soon with likely some more classical games and some calculation stuff, and hopefully some opening stuff. It's been a while, right? I haven't just spewed a bunch of opening nonsense at you guys in a while, so that will happen soon as well. Bye, guys.